So, how often are we cutting our fellow secularists and freethinkers more slack than their method deserves? I had found examples over the years of scientists on the right side of an issue who nonetheless exhibited what may be Tortucan ruts of their own. I've already noted the prickly case of Newton, but he was no secularist. Closer to home would be Carl Sagan, who had a variety of notions that were not all that well thought through. For example, he had a colossally naive innocence when it came to how scientific progress related to economic processes. It's part of the reason why the Greeks and Romans never developed a genuine scientific method. They lacked the economic and cultural incentives that drive such things. Another example of a Tortucan in secular clothing would be the late environmentalist Garrett Hardin. A socially liberal evolutionist, Hardin popularized the term tragedy of the commons in the 1960s. But it was reading one of his later books on the need to reform anti-abortion laws, Mandatory Motherhood it was called, that brought Hardin under my methodological microscope. I was not unsympathetic to his overall argument, being to this day a pro-choice guy in the abortion department. But I also couldn't help spotting something astonishing about how he went about supporting his case. At one point, Hardin cited a Czechoslovakian study to show the deleterious of fate awaiting unwanted children. Indeed, Hardin thought so much of this study that he reprinted the whole thing as an appendix, and that was his mistake. For it turned out that none of the conclusions he had drawn from it were justified. The paper repeatedly hedged its findings as not statistically significant, and yet Hardin had gone ahead and treated them all as if they were. Ever since then, I have termed the action of going out of your way to call attention to the very data that blows your own arguments to smithereens as doing a Garrett Hardin. If MHBS is indeed real, and the Tortucan mind is a genuine cognitive phenomenon, is it possible to characterize it scientifically? Test for it in the mind, isolate its neurological properties, and so on. I think so. A recent paper by Sam Harris and others in the Annals of Neurology, February 2008, showed one way when they conducted fMRI studies of belief, disbelief, and uncertainty. Anyone familiar with that paper? They checked on it. It's all available online. You've seen it? Yes, it's fabulous stuff. Oliver Sacks, I think, wrote any commentary on that too. They asked volunteers a variety of questions to which they were to indicate whether they believed the statement to be true, not true, or were unsure about it. Most of these were innocuous questions like California is larger than Rhode Island, or eagles are common pets. But slipped into the mix were some far more contentious items. A personal God exists, just as the Bible describes. Or, for atheists, there is probably no creator God. Now, the Harris study researchers were expecting the brain to engage in some fireworks when those questions came up. But to their surprise, the brain seems to be processing them all the same. Whether believing in a big California, disbelieving that people keep eagles as pets, or the existence or non-existence of God, the brain lit up with the same intensity or lack of it for all of them. The important point was that different sections of the brain were involved. One part kicking in when expression of positive belief applied, yet another area when the subject disbelieved it, and yet a third zone applying to things the person wasn't sure about. Most interestingly, the disbelief side was in a brain section related to actual physical distaste, so that the act of not believing in something was using neural paths related to things like eating a rancid pear. The Harris study was not the only one to find such connections, which suggests that there is a big neurological difference between believing in things and disbelieving in them, and this may not depend on what it is that is being disbelieved in, evolution or God, for instance. These findings shouldn't come as a shock from a Tortucan model perspective, where there wouldn't necessarily be a difference in the cognitive architecture between Tortucan religionists and Tortucan atheists versus non-Tortucan religionists or atheists. As for detecting the difference between Tortucans and non-Tortucans, though, there is, I think, a surefire way to do it. Tortucans should be able to perceive internal contradictions, those A equal not A problems again, without difficulty. We know, for example, that a Hank Hanegraaff, the young Earth creationist radio show Bible Answer Man, is perfectly capable of laying out all the many internal inconsistencies in the Book of Mormon, and that's because Hank is not a Mormon. Put Bible contradictions in front of him, though, and he no longer sees them as problems. I would suggest those are falling within his Tortucan ruts and consequently are governed by a different set of cognitive circuits. Put Hank in the MRI during this, and there should be a discernible difference in what the brain is doing. The normal suite of uncertainty detectors that would swing into play when reading the Book of Mormon might still start up until the brain realized, possibly well before any conscious perception, that one of the Tortucan ruts was being entered, in which case a new signal, say from the emotion gatekeeper, the amygdala, swamps the normal response, all without the conscious Bible Answer Man being any the wiser. If such research is undertaken and MHBS is established as a real cognitive system, then there are some potentially interesting implications for how we deal with a natural population that includes Tortucans. My gut suspicion is that the Tortucan phenomenon falls along a normal distribution bell curve, with very few people, the Feynmans of the world, populating the low end, far more people in the middle bunk, the Carl Sagans and Francis Collinses and Garrett Hardins, and relatively few occupying the far MHBS fringe, which certainly includes all contemporary creationists, Holocaust and HIV/AIDS deniers, and Apollo moon landing hoax believers. From an evolutionary perspective, that distribution may well have been well honed by selection pressure, which would suggest that there are some darn good reasons why there are as many Tortucans as there are. If you think about a Tortucan rut in a mild form, you can see that it is not necessarily a bad thing for a thinking species to have. The single-mindedness of it may well have contributed to our survival. It's the spirit of the soldier who fights on against all odds, or the scientist who perseveres in spite of public rebuke. As a culture, we tend to admire those things within limits. Think Galileo, who had a knack for not knowing when to back off. Unfortunately, the Tortucan rut is also the property of the religious or political zealot, from the Inquisition to the French Revolution's guillotine. Religions and politics may well be inherently Tortucan-friendly pursuits. Given our history, then, there is every reason to think that human societies are perfectly capable of getting along quite nicely, thank you, with the Tortucan mix they have. Of course, when extreme Tortucans get in charge, you run the risk of those societies spinning out of control, as the mid-range Tortucans are all too able to follow the pull of the motivated leadership right off the cliff, from Quetzalcoatl human sacrificers to Nazi death camp engineers. Which means the role of the secularist and freethinker is not to try to remake the human nature Tortucan bell curve to make it more Richard Dawkins-ish. Indeed, this may not be intrinsically possible, but rather our goal is far more social, to contribute to and encourage the institutional breaks that minimize the likelihood of any Tortucan extreme from getting their mitts on the reins of power in the first place. While you can't change a Tortucan's mind, you can keep them from being a nuisance. How do we do this? Not by disengagement. The recent book, The Secular Conscience, by Austin Dacey. Anyone read that one? Excellent work, if you can find it. At the library, they may very well have it here. Just hot off the presses from Prometheus Books, I think, last year. He stresses exactly these points, that liberal freethinkers have retired from the public debate all too long, unnecessarily hampered by a privacy fallacy that moral and social goods are merely private convictions, not something that civil, secular societies must grapple with openly via reasoned argument. This is where the decidable-undecidable dichotomy I mentioned before comes back into the picture. When Stephen Jay Gould sought to diffuse the religion versus science debate by proposing his NOMA argument that the two fields occupied non-overlapping magisteria, he got a lot of criticism from both camps. Skeptical thinkers rightly noted how religions seemed prone to overstepping the line, think intelligent design, while religious philosophers bristled at having their worlds circumscribed into a privatized moral and ethical limbo where science took care of everything important. In my view, Gould had got the problem almost right. It is not an issue of science versus religion, though, but rather decidable propositions, naturally the province of objective scientific investigation, versus undecidable ones, where philosophy rightly governs.